If the need for self-historicization was the initial impulse for many artists, the work of investigating these processes and creating their own methods, forms of inventory, or frameworks has continued to the present, archives becoming one of the most common tropes in contemporary art today. Ilona Németh's Eastern Sugar Project, which comprises a museum of sugar as well, while partly belonging to this genealogy, is also situated at a juncture with other types of artistic practices that developed especially after the mid-2000s in Eastern Europe, and pretty much everywhere else, in a globalized world where divisions became primarily economic ones.
Joan Scott asserts that what characterizes feminism's history and its perpetual interrogation of dominant categories is its radical refusal to settle down and to call anywhere home. Although this account refers to the path of interpretation and the anticipated course of feminist theory and history writing, it could be the trajectory of political feminist art practices as well, not necessarily of those who make par excellence political art, but whose art is inherently political and fundamentally subversive. Ilona Németh's practice followed this trajectory and moved along the lines of the ever-changing political cultural formations of the ex-East Bloc, from the turbulent times of the fall of the socialist regime to the takeover of power by oppositional forces. It followed the way the predatory capitalism inflated extremely quickly on the ruins of socialism. As an artist, she also witnessed and felt obliged to reflect on the conservative and regressive venture in which the regimes, one after another, were turning back the clocks.
So I have chosen a quote from the Battle for the 10 Million by Chris Marker that I used in the article. Fidel Castro said in 1968, when in this country not a single man would have to cut the cane with a machete, the revolution will have accomplished one of its most human missions. It would have transformed the work of an animal into really human work.
Throughout the former socialist countries, we have grown accustomed in the past decades to a landscape littered with industrial ruins. From the times when each small town was present on the economic maps and identified with some industry, little remains, sometimes a strange name for the local sports team, the meaning of which everyone has meanwhile forgotten. Some of the former factories or their sites have been taken over by the creative industries, a process that was much less successful than in the Western countries, where post-Fordist economic models allowed for and took inspiration from the flexible labor forms of the creative class. Others are now big shopping malls or household and bricolage stores where people come to buy in various processed forms wood that originated in their own countries, sometimes through illegal deforestation. However, many of these constructions are still standing skeletons, rusting and decomposing in the middle of fields or on the outskirts of cities. These latter lonely figures of history, with their scattered leftovers, including here and there some signage that indicates their former use, appear in the photographs assembled by Ilona Németh of the sugar factories in Slovakia.
One of the earliest flares of the modern world was lit on a small northern African island where in 1460s a new system for producing and distributing food took shape. In 1419, Portuguese sailors first sighted an island less than 400 miles west of Casablanca, which they called Ilha de Madeira, Island of Wood. The Venetian traveler and slaver Alvise Cadamosto reported in 1455 that there was not a foot of ground that was not entirely covered with great trees. By the 1530s, it was hard to find any wood on the island at all. There were two phases in the clear-cutting of Madeira. Initially, the trees had been profitable as lumber for shipbuilding and construction. The denuded forest became acreage for wheat to be sent back to Portugal starting in 1430s. The second, more dramatic deforestation was driven by the use of wood as fuel in sugar production. Capitalism didn't leave Madeira, it reinvented itself. With no affordable fuel, the island's only remaining trees were on the interior highland, too inaccessible to be officially fueled. New strategies emerged to bring profit from the devastated land. After sugar came wine, grown in ashes of the cane industry. Grapes demanded less labor, water, and fuel than cane. But wine needs cask, and for centuries, the wood for Madeira barrels was brought from the most economic source, the cheap forest of the New World. Commodities flowed in the other way too, as Madeira was a conduit for the Atlantic slave trade until the 18th century. In a more recent act of reinvention, the island today uses the grim history as a source of revenue through tourism. Yet, as the sugar frontier closed in Madeira, new frontiers opened elsewhere, and forces less obvious than craving for sweetness shaped the island and soon the planet.
They could not, or perhaps did not want to. And even those who wanted to failed because they produced inefficiently. They were lagging behind in technology, could not maneuver in international markets, did not speak foreign languages, did not know modern management methods. There was overemployment anywhere, since business employed a lot of people, but there was no interest in their products. Markets opened up and cheap goods entered from abroad. And although there was a cheap workforce, the entire production cycle was inefficient, and it gradually missed its chance to compete to the West. Western firms had a technological edge, and in particular, they had capital. For some time after 1989, inefficiencies could still be balanced by the low wages, a phenomenon of poor countries. But in the end of the business were either sold or foreign investors or by foreign investors or liquidated. Well, in the early 90s in Czechoslovakia, we decided that we were going to turn the tables by changing property relations.
A love letter to sugar. Dear Sugar, when I was a little girl, I was fond of everything that tasted sweet. Your presence was a moment of joy and satisfaction, a necessity, a reward. I loved you madly. Then something changed. I got confused, congested, and stuck with my feelings for you. Large amounts of unwanted information and experiences accumulated and built a separation between us. I started to commonly assume that you, Sugar, are primarily concerned with consumerism and materialism, that you work hand in hand with capitalism, that you divided continents, created political and racial conflicts, polemics about imports, exports, nurtured child labor, and exposed immigration restriction. I heard it many times: sugar, slaves, crops, death, violence, exploitation, big businesses. Big sugar, obesity, diabetes, death, blah, blah, blah. Bewitched by language and gaslighted by the discourse of the glycosine, I thought of you as a stable object, as an additive to other things, as a part of the dual matters that owns, manipulates, and kills. I fix you in a static space-time, seeing you as inert and calculable. I felt guilty. I had moments when I really hated you.
What you've heard now were excerpts of or from the many texts written and published in this book that we're presenting today by Ilona Németh and edited by Maja Reuben Fowkes, Eastern Sugar. It's available here in English, and I think there's also a Slovak version around. The project evolved out of Ilona Németh's research. As I was stating at the beginning, in the past decades, there's been a lot of artistic research on several topics, and Ilona found that actually it came from her childhood in Dunajská Streda, in the town where she grew up, where you had one of those sugar factories that were all over the Eastern Hemisphere or Eastern Europe at that time, which was bought in 1993 by a French-British transnational company and finally closed in 2006 due to European Union laws that tried to prevent overproduction and then basically finance these companies that in order, well, to have them shut down. And the whole book is structured according to several topics, chapters, or thematic themes, which I would like to talk. Have Maja and Reuben talk maybe a little bit on the creation, on the kind of conception of this whole book that, of course, goes far beyond the only one topic that Ilona started with, but she also then took on research on the whole production of, or the whole closing and existence of sugar factories in Slovakia, Czech Republic, Hungary, etc., and was then accompanied by Olja Triaška Stefanović, who is also here, the photographer. But maybe first, Maja and Reuben, you want to say something about the conception of the book and how this evolved, and also with the additional research, because what we have here is a whole history on production of sugar, of course, how it evolved in different centuries, also like engendering the whole slavery production, etc. But I don't want to kind of like have a monologue right now, but give you the floor to talk about the evolution or the creation of this project.
Okay. Thanks a lot for introduction, Walter. And the book came about through the invitation of Ilona for us to edit the book for the project Eastern Sugar, and it took as its starting point, as you said, Ilona's long-term research into originally the histories of the Slovak sugar industry. And what we tried to do was to take that as a starting point and expand in two directions. So on the one hand, we wanted to think more widely across Eastern Europe about the issues of transition, the economic and social transition of post-socialism. And because the work that she did on the Slovak sugar industry is really as a way into thinking about the changes that happened. And in the book, you find a lot of reflections also on the way the transition happened in the 1990s, the influx of foreign capital, the way the local economic actors were unprepared for those changes, and also some of the phenomena such as corruption, different forms of tunneling and other special forms of corruption that emerged in those years, and kind of looking from sugar across the whole story of the transition in Eastern Europe. And the other direction that we wanted to expand the project or kind of take further the ideas that she started with us to look at sugar and to bring in the other sugar context. So to think of sugar not just in its Slovak and Central European context, but also this other sugar. So this story of Eastern sugar is the story of sugar beet. But of course, there are two kinds of sugar, sugar cane and sugar beet, and we wanted to bring in the stories of sugar cane, the different trajectories, global historical trajectories of sugar cane as well. Do you want to?
Maybe you can also say about the sections of how we divided the book. But really, because the Eastern Sugar project is so complex, and there are so many different directions it could take us, we try to, as you could hear from the reading, go to very many different points of reference that the project is calling for. So we have art historians contextualizing the work in the recent art histories and regional transformations in Eastern Europe, but we also have parallel conversations between artists, Ilona Németh and Annalie Davis in Caribbean, an artist who has also very close personal history of sugar from the Caribbean perspective, and they're same generation artists, and they found a common voice in speaking these parallel histories, which have enveloped in a kind of natural way in the book as well. We have environmental historians giving long histories of sugar, but we also have economic historians, which are kind of rethinking the histories of post-89 in Eastern Europe, and considering the different potentials that the history could have taken around 89, because it wasn't so sure it will go the way it did. So all these different aspects of the exhibition, of the project were addressed in the book.
So just to maybe say a word about the structures. Walter invited us to also mention the structures. If you open the book, at the contents page, you'll see that there are somehow two ways into the book. So there are, thank you. So there's the text, the textual contributions. We kind of were inspired a little bit by the seasonal processes of sugar production to organize those very diverse contributions. So the first section is sowing the system, and we were thinking about the process of sowing the sugar beet seeds, and as a beginning, but also more widely about the origins of this extractive system, that sugar is kind of the epitome of the extractive capitalist system, and how it started, these longer histories going back to slavery and colonialism. And so there are some of the contributions in that section. Then we were looking, the second section is labors of ripening. So this is about the sugar plants growing, and also the different methods for making them grow, irrigation and fertilizers and so on, but also about the changes and the labor. The question of labor is also very important in the book, and labor in an East European context, and also more widely. And then the next section is harvesting transition, which focuses again more precisely on these questions of the economic and social transition in Central Europe, but also globally. It's the processes of globalization and how they continue to transform the planet. And the final section is crystallizing ecologies, and in a way that's maybe looking a little bit to the futures of sugar, and this idea of a post-sucrose world, a post-sucrose future, and how, you know, also with the trend away from sugar as a sweetener and other discovering and developing other uses for sugar as a biofuel, and the kind of thinking about the futures of sugar. So that's just the kind of textual side. And in parallel, we have these 10 extraordinary visual essays by Ilona, and mostly with Olja's photographs as well in them. And they're fold-out sections which tell the histories of specific factories, sugar factories in Eastern Europe that all closed in this period that we're looking at, in this post-communist period, especially around 2006, 2007, and including all the factories in the Eastern Sugar kind of empire, as we call it in the book, that Walter also mentioned at the beginning, and also all the sugar factories in Slovakia that were operating in '89 and then also closed in this period.
Maybe now pass on to Ilona, and that you talk a little bit about the genealogy of this whole project. I mean, coming from your own town and how you developed it, and maybe you want to like talk together with Olja, because Olja did most of the photographs, and how you did the research, how did you find out about all those different factories, the histories, and like moving around in the territory and kind of creating that visual essay that we have in the book.
So, you know, the starting point was really the history of our sugar factory, so-called Eastern Sugar. And so I'm not going to talk about the circumstances why and how I started to research, but it's important to understand that the disadvantage of the country that is too small, it means also advantage in research, because you have a possibility to make a quantitative research. It means that it was possible to research all the 10 factories which were in function in 1989. So it means that I can travel everywhere to visit the sites and make this research very properly. And from the beginning, we were cooperating with Olja Triaška Stefanović, who I know from her very nice photos and great photos of the different architectural sites. So that's why I invited her to cooperate. Then we visited all the sites together, and it was the first round in 2018, and the second and 17, and the second round was just last year, so 2020, when we went back to we traveled back to the sites, and we can compare what happened during this 2-year period. And this traveling allowed us also to talk to the local people who were working in the factories, who were in the leading positions in the factories. So our archive, or my archive, grows with the informations, with the different perspectives during these 4 years. So maybe I can give a microphone to Olja.
About the collaboration and your take on the sites in terms of photography and how you approach the different factories and yeah.
That's why I chose to read this love letter to sugar by Aneta Monakisha, artist, with her text in the book, because I had also very mixed feelings and emotions when we started to travel and started to make visual research. First was curiosity, then was excitement, and then was a strange love and hate relationship to those skeleton of the sugar factories. It was very important for us to realize in one moment that it is not the end of the first walking and doing these trips to each abounded sugar factory, and that's why, from that reason, we knew that we will go much more deeper in the story and to find the topics that are related to each one of the factories. So it's not just the skeletons that we saw on the images, but it is also the topics, how it was connected with the Jewish community in the history and the starting of the building the sugar factories. Also, how was important to grow locals in the beginning of the 19th century. How it was important to grow the community around this sugar factory. And also we were interested in how this history and the history traces was made the impact now after the closing the factory. And all of those moments were in our talks. We talk a lot with Ilona, and that was also very good, this contact and dialogue, because we were all the time together, and we started to walk, and then we finished this visual road trip researching walks with Ilona's performative act, where she declared one chimney in Pohronski Ruskov, in a village, as a national cultural monument, because it was not possible to declare it officially but by the institution. But and that was something very also important to me, that Ilona left these traces there, and it stayed there. And also with the project, so you can see it also in the book. So I hope that images will tell you in the moments of the bricks and empty windows and broken ceilings, some part of the history that was very important for the growing sugar industries, and then later collapsed with everything was already told by Reuben or Maja with this economist side of the views.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe one interesting part I want to address here is that the transformation process from, let's say, southern sugar to eastern sugar, because the company that you had was named Eastern Sugar, but historically sugar is something that's connected to the global south. Also, when you, of course, deal with plantations and sugar cane in this case, but maybe you want to tell a little bit about the story, where you also see the video in the exhibition, actually, about the history of that particular factory.
So the history of the renaming of the factory, I called it as a lost in translation. The content is lost in translation. That the name of the factory was this, as you told, South Sugar. And when the French English company came, they decided to rename it to Eastern Sugar. But the reason was, which is But we were talking about this topic with Christian Lauer, who was one of the leaders of the Eastern Sugar Company in Middle Europe. The video is in the archive, really, and you can see it also in the rotor. He is answering that we had already a company in the United States. The name was Western Sugar, so we know we just decided if we have Western Sugar, let's have also Eastern Sugar. So that was the reason why it was renamed. For me, the signs on the reception building, which was the only remain building in my town, was very important to think about how we can place the signs in the public place in my town. So it will happen this December that there will be a public art piece on one of the roofs of the buildings, which is the property still of the state, of the town. It was very important because they have this just 3 buildings in the town. So I decided to talk to the mayor who agreed, it looks like, and then we will place the signs into the city. So I think we have to think and face the history of the city, as we were a Jewish city and nobody is talking about that until now. So this is also a part of our history in connection with this industry, which was not just a sugar factory, but of course it was the most important industry part of the whole region, with the agriculture workers, with the logistics, with everything. So it doesn't mean just a factory, but the region was led by somehow with this issue. But maybe to understand why I started and why Eastern Sugar or why sugar. So it was really the starting point was for me the growing nationalism and populism in our region after the 2010, and it is visible now. We are talking about the same topics, and sometimes I have a feeling that we are going in the opposite direction. What we started to build up after the changes. And after the studying the nationalism and populism, the roots, of course, I find in the economy. And for me, the Eastern Sugar and the sugar industry was a tool to talk about this issue. And this is the key for the project for me. How to communicate the content, how to communicate where we are now and who we are now, and that was the most important part for me.
Thank you. Maybe that's a link to Edith András, art theorist and historian who also contributed with the text to the book. And I mean, as you said in your beginning statement, I mean, you were writing about the issue of nationalism in Hungary, the monuments, how they function, but also address the notion of feminism. And you said that the 60s claim of the personal is political is not really pertinent here in this case. How do you situate, I mean, Ilona's work and the situation at the moment in terms of addressing this rising nationalist tendencies, where basically every cultural endeavor is kind of not really accepted, but kind of annihilated or something sometimes like this?
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to say that I'm truly honored to be involved in this book, which is very complex, and actually my task was very complex as well. So if I asked permission from Maja and Reuben to read a short sentence from the email they wrote to me, where they commissioned me to write a text. So, ideally, you should focus on the entangled issues around feminism, nationalism, and populism in general in Hungary and the region. And if you find connections with Ilona's practice, it would be good to write about this. Does this sound okay? So first I was truly frightened. So I thought that this has to be truly a very complex, and it was first challenging for me. So I tried to fulfill the expectations, and that is why I connected these seemingly different issues like nationalism, populism, and feminism and Ilona's work. So you will find this interwoven texture of the text. And yes, as you posed, there are many difficult, heavy questions. For example, when you were speaking about that Personal is political slogan, which is a basic slogan in feminist history, and I did find it very disturbing because maybe this slogan is valid in a Western context, but I felt that this is not the case in Eastern context, and we have to make a difference because in Eastern Europe, I did find that there is a shift because it is so heavily over-politicized that everyone has to make it personal. So it is the opposite. It means the case is opposite in Eastern Europe, that political is personalized. And this I felt in Ilona's works, that her activity was always very strongly political, but not in a one-dimensional manner. And then the other thing is that, as Ilona also mentioned, that the trajectory in Hungary is so very different from that we expected in the time of the transition, that somehow an art historian feels a need somehow to detect the mechanism and especially how it is demonstrated in visuality. And we cannot underestimate the power of this visual propaganda. And that is why I agree with Ilona and Maja and Reuben that this is a question we cannot ignore when we are speaking about the transition in the region.
I just want to say, as you can see, Eastern Sugar is an incredibly ambitious project, and the book is also incredibly ambitious. So every text had to do what they were meant to do. But why we asked Edith to do precisely that? Because there is a prehistory to Eastern Sugar, and that is something that Ilona and Edith were collaborating on, which is the private nationalism exhibition and project. And this is a thing where Ilona already mentioned that's where the understanding came that the populism and political crisis is actually deeper and more connected to the question of economic transition and all the failures that went through. And that's why it was very important to have this aspect of politics and of contemporary situation, but really to think also what went behind the scenes and what's at the deeper kind of more systemic problem as well. I think Ferenc had a completely different task.
Yeah, I was going to come to talk to Ferenc Gróf, also artist from Hungary. You also participated in the exhibition here at Sugar, dealing with the Code Noir situation and Napoleon, and you also contributed an text, an essay, but it's more kind of like a overview of different artists' works, etc. So what was the kind of idea that you had behind this, or were you given any instructions, or just came up with your own contribution?
So from the very beginning, when we started to talk with Ilona about the project, she asked me to work on a kind of a diagram map. So it was a kind of a commission, a friendly commission, but still. And actually, my other task in the project was to curate an exhibition in Bourges. Bourges is it's a small city in the center of France, where I teach. Veronique is here, who is responsible for La Box. So I had this task of curator as well. So I had to find a way to export this project in the center of France, and France had a really important role, just like the UK and other Western countries in the development of sugar industry. Especially France in the sugar beet industry after the Haitian Revolution, Napoleon helped the development of this industry in the European continent. I mean, on territory of France. So these were these two parallel tasks. So to make a map and make an exhibition. So I tried to find a way to transpose these original problematics, very, very specific problematics of the political changes in Eastern Europe to the Western French context. In France, this kind of huge trauma of desindustrialization, so it's like the disindustrialization, happens almost every time. There were several waves of closing, textile industry has disappeared already, etc. Now, barely, there are some very high level industries staying there. So it's like their vision is really different from that. I think they can't really understand why it was so a traumatic period in Eastern Europe after socialism. So that's how I try to move on back to the past of the slave economy, the colonization, etc. So for the exhibition, I found a work of a film of Chris Marker. I was really happy to find that movie. So Chris Marker made in 70 a film about Cuba, about it's called Battle for the 10 Million. It was a huge effort of the socialist Cuba to produce 10 million tons of sugar, which failed, and the problem started in the east of Cuba. So I found it interesting to connect the east of Cuba with Eastern Europe, and it became a kind of dialogue between Eastern Europe and the Caribbean territory, and all this history of sugarcane and sugar beet got connected.
Yeah, this connection on work traditions, etc. I mean, Ilona, in your also exhibition at the Kunsthalle in Bratislava, you had this workshop that we also saw yesterday a little bit, where people were able to produce those sugar loaves. I would rather say cones in terms of the shape, but you want to tell me a little bit about this approach of staging the photographs in the exhibition that, I mean, we've also seen here, but also having this workshop that was, of course, much bigger effort in Bratislava, but maybe you want to talk a little bit about this.
Yes, in Bratislava, it was in 2018. So when I started to research, I collected so many informations, and then one of the factories in Sereď, which is still working factory, and it is a property of Agrana, because we have now two factories in Slovakia. One is in Austria, and the second one is in German property. So it was in the Agrana, the Austrian factory. Then in laboratory, the woman who was working there for ages, I don't know, also in the socialist times. So she showed me that she was just telling me the story that every year when the new campaign, the so-called campaign, when you are starting to produce the new sugar, in all factories they are making sugar loaves, and they are sending it to each other as this represents a new sugar every year. So it is some kind of beginning, the season beginning. So it a burn of the new sugar is born. So it is a celebration, and it came of the history is that before this industrialization, the sugar you can buy just in this form, this sugar loaf. So it was until the beginning of the 20th century, 19, 20, 30. And just to tell you that yesterday somebody in the rotor who was from Iran, he thought that it is still used in Iran, the form of the sugar. So it was just interesting from yesterday. So the woman, she showed me this method how to make it, and it was just really a 10-minute work, but it opens my mind to the. So I understood that when you are making the sugar loaves by your hand, it is a process which is connected to your mind, of course, and it opens your mind to another knowledge somehow through this physical experience. And that time I already was thinking how to represent the labor on the exhibition, or how to represent the sugar as a material. And when I tried at home to make the first sugar loaf, then I understand that it could be a good tool in my hand to communicate the content. And we tried it first in Prague in small scale. It was the first exhibition in Eastern Sugar. And after that in Bratislava, through the advertisement, I find in a cooperation with the local unemployed office, I find so we made an open call for the positions, and then 40 people that applied, and it was also tricky in that way that I doesn't want to have some kind of showcase for the workers who are working there. So it was a very sensitive issue. I think we managed it quite well, and we also informed the people what they are doing, why they are doing that, if they like it or not, or what is the reason, and all of them, they have some kind of connection to the sugar industry. So that was the manufacturer. It was not a so if I compare it to Rotor exhibition, in Rotor. I have here with the cooperation partners the part of the archive what we are still building up. We have 15 videos, we have hundreds of photographs, a lot of information, a lot of books. So it is really a part of the archive. And the table and the set to make a sugar loaf it is demonstration how you can try to make. So in manufacture in Bratislava there was a different purpose, and after that it was once exhibited again. It was in Schaffhof in Freising, in Europäische Kunsthaus Gallery, and it was more also about demonstration. It was not a working manufacture.
So maybe if I could just add and comment further on that. I mean, I think that both the Manufaktura and the approach of the Eastern Sugar Book is not to give a kind of idealized, rosy picture of the socialist past and relations between people then, but to create I think the Manufaktura really does that, create a place for discussion and dialogue about the complexities of those histories, like the good and the bad sides of them. And, and these are really complex histories, which the book also tries to explore. There are also essays, it's an essay comparing the situation a little bit with the Polish case as well, of the way deindustrialization also its social effects in Poland, also through art practices as well, and also through Ilona's practice. So it's somehow, Ilona's position, the book's position towards that socialist past is quite complex, and it's not about idealization, but it's about really finding out how people live differently, the different situations, and the potential that there was in that situation for people to find moments of joy and rest and so on, which could be different to the current situation of the transition and the kind of lives, accelerated lives that people live, also facing unemployment and so on in the post-socialist lands as well, and everywhere actually.
Yeah, maybe at this point you might want to explain the phenomenon of tunneling, because I think people here are not aware of what that is, just, because that's also like an important process. I mean, not important, but a process that took place, unfortunately. So either of you.
I mean, this term tunneling, which was something which came up in quite a lot of the interviews, I think, that Ilona did, and also is explained also in one of the contributions in this conversation between two Slovak political theorists, cultural theorists, commentators, and it's really this process by which the owners of publicly owned former communist factories found a way of privatizing the factories in a way that it kind of like entered a tunnel, and when at the other end of the tunnel, all the like loss-making parts of the company were just closed down, and the profitable bits somehow got privatized, and the directors ended up rich and the owners of the company and so on. So it's really about the techniques during the era of wild capitalism in Eastern Europe for people to enrich themselves through corruption, and that's not to say that doesn't exist everywhere. As these Pandora Papers that just came out recently, it's not something that just happened in Eastern Europe, and the situation again was really complicated, with people being at a big disadvantage compared to the Western companies that came in and developing ways to survive and so on. So I mean, it's not a simple picture at all, but it is something that happened, and this term is quite compelling of tunneling, to describe the kinds of opportunistic economic activity that went on, and the way the elites, the communist era elites, managed to manage this transition to post-socialism and to the current era quite well in terms of their own personal interests, and that's also maybe also one of the roots of the dissatisfaction that a lot of people feel today.
Yeah, at this point, maybe I want to ask if there are any questions by the audience. I mean, you've all seen the exhibition yesterday, as far as I can see, and if there's any questions to the artists, to Ilona or anybody, please, yeah, raise your hand.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the connection to the Jewish past of the sugar industry, sugar production, because Olja mentioned that in one sentence that in the beginning of sugar production in Czechoslovakia or the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, lots of the owners of the sugar companies were by Jewish origin. So, I mean, some of those factories that you were traveling to, they were founded after 45, but some maybe before. So, is this somehow visible in the project also, this Jewish history?
Yes, we from the 10 factories, in fact, they were just 2 built after 50s. So it means that after the Second World War, in Rimavská Sobota and in my town, Dunajská Streda, only just 2 factories they were built in this period. So the other factories from these 10 working factories in 89, because there were different factories which were opened and closed and opened and closed, the same story as in Austria and then all over the Europe. Mostly they were founded by families who had Jewish roots, and also that's why they were the owners who also can change from the middle of the 19th century after until the Second World War. The owners, sometimes they were changed, of course, sometimes this was the same family as in Sladkovičovo, where the Kufner family was the owner until the 1938 when they emigrated to the United States. And the Šurany factory was also founded by the Jewish family and owned until the Second World War. And after the Holocaust, the owners, of course, cannot come back, and also in the 50s there was the state owner. This was the transformation into the state property. So they not just lost the property, they were killed, but after that also the family, they didn't get back the property. So it was the state-owned factory period, and then the socialist time, and after 89, no from the factories was given back to the original owners. No one, no. And there are some factories which are particularly connected to the Jewish culture, and it was in Sladkovičovo and it was in Šurany, and which is also in the book, that in Šurany the factory or the sugar museum, which doesn't exist, but it is part of the state, the Stadtmuseum, as we are here. So it is in the synagogue. It is in the former synagogue. So the synagogue became a museum in the 90s, and now it is partly the Museum of Sugar, which is the most strange place what we visited.
Any other questions or comments from the panelists still? Still?
I mean, that's just a question.
I think I would like to pose or ask you one question, Ilona, or also you as editors of the book or on your researches. It relates to one of the work which is shown in the exhibition right now by Sandro, and he brought this factory case from Georgia. It's a still existing factory in Agara, town not, let's say, far away from Tbilisi. And what I found interesting in that, how to say, description of his work was that after 2017, the factory was closed. Probably Sandro can tell about the reasons, but what I'm interested in, after 5 months, let's say the workers organized the strike because a lot of people belong to that factory, and I think this is exactly similar to that what you also were telling, Ilona, that the farmers were working because of the beet production and so on, and the workers in the factory. And this strike was successful. It's also something what we were very interested in showing that work, because it was then privatized, but strongly supported by the also Georgian government that it's in function. Were there any similar cases in Slovakia, for example, or in the region which you were researching in, or you all were researching in, that workers organized themselves, let's say, and the people who, let's say, belong to that, how to say, also income of that factory?
So thank you for the questions. A lot of people, they ask me in different countries if they were demonstrations, but I have to tell you that there were no demonstrations. I think it is because of this optimistic period, especially in the 90s, where we were open to the others or to the western part of the Europe, that there was some kind of, it was not a resignation, it was a reaction on the socialist type of living, that you just think that you have not really you cannot enter, you cannot change your life or something. I can just answer maybe in that way, that it is some kind of, we are not going to make anything maybe, or the second reason could be also that the people immediately they try to find the new jobs. So it was not really the reaction. Maybe it was not. Maybe I cannot believe that it will happen like this, or it would continue like this, or they didn't understand their role in the story, maybe. But I know that from the so-called Eastern Sugar Empire, the Hungarian company, in the Hungarian town Kaba, there were demonstrations, but but they were organized by the city government, because the new mayor, the woman whom I made also interview, she was talking about that nobody knows that the factory will close in a second day. So she was elected for the position, and the second day the Eastern Sugar Company communicated that they will close the most important company. So there was not a cooperation, and then that period it was, so there were demonstrations in Hungary. But in Slovakia, I don't know about that. But I know from Ferenc that in France there are demonstrations because the process is still on.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, actually, which is the big difference, that in that region, you know well that with the political changes, the whole political left was completely destroyed, annihilated. And today, if someone talks about Karl Marx, they will say, okay, you want Gulag. So this so-called totalitarian ideology, like this American point of view, to put an equal sign between the red star and the swastika, it was very successful in this region. And there is no effective trade union life, as I know in Hungary. I don't. It must be something like this in Slovakia, I guess. So actually the trade unions in Hungary, there are some, but they are working for the capitalists. very basically. So they are not, and this is not the same in France. In France, there is a continuous tradition of the workers' movement. There are trade unions which are really independent and who will go and fight. And if needed, they fight the police or they will close the factories, etc. So this is very different. And so in Hungary, the workers, they are completely atomized. They work in atomized condition. And there are a lot of factories that actually it's completely forbidden. If you want to join a trade union, you will be fired, and that's all. So that's why it's pretty hard. And the other thing is that the whole political spectrum is on the right, and center right, and far right, of course. And it's impossible to mobilize them only on really like xenophobic reasons. That's the only thing.
Yeah, just to add and to also agree with both of you and what Ilona was saying about this particular moment that the closures happened in the 2000s. It was kind of the peak of globalization, of this kind of optimistic phase of globalization, and also belief and integration and belief in the kind of inevitability, the economic inevitability. Like, you know, if the factory had to close, there must be an economic reason. But actually, if you look deeper into it, as this project does, you actually found there was no compelling economic reason. You know, the Dunajská Streda factory and a lot of others were kind of functioned perfectly well. It was a political decision, kind of an ideological decision, a political decision to close those factories first rather than the other ones. And it didn't have to happen that way. So they could also have been kept going, and maybe in some countries they did. So but at that moment, the belief in the kind of neoliberal ideology of the market knows best was so strong in the 2000s that people were a bit resigned to it and didn't find a way to like articulate a resistance or a different strategy at that moment. So it was both the weakness of the workers' movement and this kind of mental state at the time.
Came together, yeah.
And I would like to add something also from the point of view of nationalism, that this neo-nationalism first totally killed the solidarity between different stratas of the society. And this is a very, very effective strategy. So this is one thing. The other thing is that the failure is projected back to the person, to the individual. For example, it was said in the Hungarian parliament that you have the same value as you earn. So if you cannot earn more money, then you are a trash of the society. So there is this imposed competition and separation, as you said, exactly this isolation, separation of different stratas. And I do believe this is one of the most frightening characteristics of this populism.
But I also want, I mean, there is question. Okay, I will just, maybe there is a microphone that can go there. I just want to say that this kind of social workers' histories were also very much embedded into the material histories and environmental histories in the book and in the project. So perhaps the images can show you, and this is another very compelling parallel with the Caribbean, because once they deforested the islands for the sugar plantation and monoculture, and then when the sugar industry collapsed in Caribbean, there were only weeds left. You know, this is kind of like a post-industrial landscape there, and we have a similar kind of socialist ruins in Eastern Europe, and the weeds are growing and the nature's coming back, and this kind of like, it's very much another kind of histories are unfolding, which are not just human histories, but also plant histories or planetary histories, which are behind the project as well.
So thanks for the presentation. I just wanted to stress, coming from the Global South perspective, I think it's the sugar cane, it's our colonial trauma. The plantation is inside of our trauma, how racialization and dehumanization, because it's actually, it's where black and brown bodies still facing the trauma of the plantation, we still live in the plantation. So this continuation of the plantation in our reality, it's actually something that we cannot, it's very complex in the history, how the sugar cane and the plantation, especially what happened in Brazil now, that's actually Brazil, it's a colonial farm. So Bolsonaro is just actually bringing this colonial history it's a coming out of the colonial history of Brazil. That many years was actually believed that we had a racial democracy in the process of racialization. And I think this is a very important thing when we come to question of migration, when we come to question of, the work of Alessandra dos Santos Silva, that's why I'm here. I have the honor to be her friend, and I think it brings out in the exhibition the question how black bodies moves and navigates the questions of the trauma and the racism and the humanization through the plantation that we have to face it every day in our lives. So I think it's important to I know that's very specific what you're brought now as a Eastern history and the connections, but I think it's this trauma. It's not just a kind of psychological. It's a history of how we navigate the past and the future and now. So what is the visions of and the construction of human being, and those that are actually seen as human beings, and how it affects our bodies as seen as no human beings. And maybe we decide not to be a human being. In this constellation that being a human being is still in a very white supremacistic way of existing.
Yeah, so first of all, I wanted to say thank you for this great presentation, and I think you made everything very clear, so I find it hard to find questions, but I have a basic question to Ilona. It's such a complex, great project, so how do you think, is it now finished for you? Will you continue? And I also liked very much the comment that you said it's for you it was a kind of a tool to address like nationalism, populism, these transformation processes. And so my question would be, will you continue to use this kind of archive you created as this kind of tool? And if you could comment on it a little bit further, please.
Thank you for the question. So we are at the end of the Creative Europe period, which will finish with our partners also, who is one of the partners, Rotor as well, and the end of the October. And we have to think how to continue. But in my artistic program, I have not choice. So it means that I'm an artist who cannot make not comments to the political issues and the problems in the society. So in my artistic program, I will continue. I'm not sure if we can stop the research in this topic of the sugar, because it has still some passes which were never, we didn't went on them. So it's hard to tell, but for my view as an artist program, then for sure I will continue.
Maybe just thanks so much for the comment also about the sugar plantations and the aftermaths of colonialism and slavery and racialization, which is also addressed in the book and also the wider project through the involvement of artist Annalie Davis and her work also, and she's in dialogue. So we wanted to kind of also with the book bring together, I think was mentioned already, this discussion and dialogue between Ilona and an artist who shares many kind of similar interests, but comes from a different geography and is dealing with these different histories. She actually lives on, and her studio is on a former sugar plantation, which is now, and part of her practice, for example, which is discussed in the book, is walking around the fields and like picking up fragments and finding ways of investigating, and also somehow thinking about ways of like socially and ecologically healing the damage, the incredible damage done by slavery. And you mentioned Dos Santos, there's another important reference is Sylvia Wynter and her philosophy, her thinking around the fact that there were also points of resistance that the slaves also within the plantation through the developing the slave plot, there was also a place where they could grow their own foods. And it was a kind of a counter, both kind of in terms of keeping alive and developing identities and different epistemologies, if you like, and also for plants. So like things which were pushed off through the monoculture, pushed out of the sugarcane fields, actually survived and continued to flourish on the in these plots that these slaves were allowed to grow on the margins of the fields in order to grow food to eat. And the plants that were growing there were things like yams and also medicinal plants. And there's also a whole kind of artistic history and of wild botanicals that, for example, Annalie Davis has investigated these histories in her work. And just one more thing, what's interesting is after the cane plantations have closed down and so on, what's happened is the wild botanicals and the plants have like come back from the former slave plots and started like recolonizing or spreading in those and bringing back biodiversity to those former plantation fields, which is maybe a kind of a message of how there might be a way of like recuperating in some way of trying to think through those histories and find a different way forward for it. So it's a really important point. Thank you.
If you are interested in this area, then on Friday, next Friday, will be the discussion with Annalie Davis on the live stream on the Kushale, Bratislava. So you can join the live stream presentation of her artistic practice and also later on discussion.
Can I just... We have more.
Yeah, we're pretty much done, but you can, of course,
I just want to like a last thought I want to really say about the designer of the book, because it's an object and we should also objectify it as a book object, because it's a really amazing publication. And we know we have amazing photography and visual essays and research, and we talked a lot about the content and the maps, but there is really, you can really have a look, because it's loads of effort put into designing the publication. It's a really specially done and lots of thought put on how to combine visual essays with the textual aspects, and folding out and telling different stories and overlaps between these histories. And this is the hard work of Ilona, but also Peter Liska, who designed it, and he's not here, but I just wanted to mention. And so it's a huge. I think you should really have a look at the book.
Thank you, Maja, and yeah, thank you to all of you, the participants in this panel, but also contributors to the great book, which I can only recommend to everyone. It really has a lot of content, different essays from different angles, and I mean, there was a lot, of course, there is a lot that we all don't know or haven't known, so it's really interesting research project, and yeah, it's available here, and just want to thank everyone, and yeah, have a nice rest of Saturday. Thank you.